For Ben Carter and Chloe Davis, it was just a renovation, a necessary battle against the drafts and inefficiencies of an old house, waged with a sledgehammer and a crowbar. They had no idea that when they started breaking apart the old brick fireplace in the autumn of 2023, they weren't just tearing down a wall. They were demolishing 38 years of silence and striking the first crack in a lie that a whole town had learned to accept as truth. The sound of the impact echoed for only a moment, but it was loud enough to awaken a story that had been sleeping for a very, very long time. The story begins in October of 1985 in Maple Creek, Vermont. It was a town painted in the hues of early autumn, where the air was crisp with the smell of wood smoke and decaying leaves. Life here was measured and predictable, governed by the changing of the seasons and the steady hum of the local economy, the Finch Timber Company. And no one embodied the town's predictable rhythm more than Arthur Pendleton. At 58 years old, Arthur was a widower and a man of quiet, unwavering habit. His life was a series of small, comforting rituals. He rose before the sun, prepared his oatmeal and black coffee, and would sit by the window, watching the light creep over the green mountains. By 7 a.m., he was in his official United States Postal Service van, its engine turning over with a familiar, reliable groan. For 30 years, he had been more than a postman. He was a silent keeper of the town's connections, the carrier of its news, its joys and its sorrows, all sealed in folded paper. On the morning of October 24th, his routine was no different, but his observations were. Driving his route along the winding old forest road, Arthur slowed his van. To his right, nearly swallowed by the overgrown maples, was a decommissioned logging trail. It was federal land, closed to all vehicles for over a decade, but on this morning, there were fresh, deep ruts in the mud, and pulling out from the forbidden road was a heavy-duty logging truck, its sides splattered with dirt, its bed suspiciously empty. The logo on the door was unmistakable, the stylized pine tree of the Finch Timber Company. Arthur pulled his van to the shoulder, watching as the truck rumbled past him. He caught a brief, hostile glare from the young man behind the wheel, a face he recognized but couldn't immediately place. Arthur reached for the small, spiral-bound notebook he kept on his dashboard. With a pencil, he meticulously wrote down the date, the time, and the 6 letters and numbers on the truck's license plate. It was a small act of diligence, a detail that didn't fit the pattern, and Arthur Pendleton always paid attention to the details. That was the last entry he would ever make. The next morning, his postal van was found parked on the shoulder of that same road. The keys were still in the ignition. The driver's side door was slightly ajar, as if he had just stepped out for a moment. A half-sorted stack of letters for the houses on Cedar Lane sat neatly on the passenger seat. Of Arthur there was no sign. The town's police chief, a man who had grown up with and was deeply loyal to the Finch family, organized the search. For 3 days, volunteers and officers combed the dense woods. They found nothing. No footprints, no torn clothing, no sign of a struggle. The official theories began to circulate almost immediately. Perhaps he'd had a medical emergency and wandered off, disoriented. Or maybe, some whispered, the quiet, lonely man had finally buckled under a private sadness and simply walked away from his life. His daughter, Sarah, flew in from Oregon. She was a whirlwind of frantic energy and disbelief. She told the chief that her father was not a man of impulse, he was a man of patterns. He wouldn't abandon his post any more than the sun would fail to rise. He was methodical, he was responsible, and he was gone. Her pleas were met with sympathetic nods and placating remarks. The investigation, she felt, was being steered toward the simplest conclusion, not the truest one. Within a few weeks, the search was scaled back. Winter arrived, burying the Vermont landscape and any remaining questions under a thick blanket of snow. The seasons turned, the years passed. The story of Arthur Pendleton's disappearance slowly transformed. It ceased to be an active mystery and became a piece of Maple Creek folklore, a local ghost story about the quiet postman who drove into the autumn woods and vanished into the air, leaving nothing behind but an empty van and a silence that would last for 38 years. 38 winters came and went. The Pendleton house stood, a silent witness on the edge of town. Its paint peeled, its shutters sagged, and the garden surrendered to weeds and wildflowers. The story of its former occupant became a footnote, a name in a cold case file gathering dust in the county clerk's office. The house held its breath, waiting. In the spring of 2023, it finally exhaled when Ben Carter and Chloe Davis turned the key in the rusty lock. They were refugees from the city, seeking a quiet life that existed beyond their laptop screens. Ben was a web developer, a man who built things in the digital world but craved the tangible satisfaction of wood and stone. Chloe was a freelance historian and archivist, a woman who made her living by breathing life into forgotten documents and faded photographs. For them, the dilapidated house wasn't a wreck, it was a canvas. They saw past the leaky faucets and the creaking floors to the sturdy bones beneath. They were buying not just a property, but a project, a chance to build a future by restoring a piece of the past. Their first few months were a blur of practicalities. They patched the roof, updated the ancient electrical wiring, and waged a relentless war against a persistent colony of carpenter ants. The house was slowly yielding to their efforts, its character emerging from decades of neglect. As summer faded, and the first hints of autumn colored the surrounding maple trees, their attention turned to the heart of the home, the living room fireplace. It was a massive, inefficient structure of soot-stained brick, occupying an entire wall. It drew more cold air down the chimney than it radiated heat, and with the notorious Vermont winter approaching, it was more of a liability than an asset. Their plan was simple: demolish the old hearth and install a modern high-efficiency wood stove. The work began on a Saturday morning. The air was filled with the rhythmic crash of Ben's sledgehammer against brick and the scrape of Chloe's shovel as she cleared the rubble. It was hard, dusty, satisfying labor. They worked for hours, sweat cutting paths through the grime on their faces. By late afternoon, they had removed most of the outer structure, revealing the dark, solid brickwork of the chimney flue itself. It was there, near the floor in the back of the firebox, that the pattern was broken. Ben swung the hammer and was met not with a sharp crack but with a dull, hollow thud. He stopped, his arms aching. "That's weird," he said, wiping his brow. He tapped the spot again, this time with the claw of a hammer. The sound was unmistakably hollow. Chloe knelt beside him, shining the light from her phone onto the spot. One of the bricks was slightly recessed, its mortar crumbling in a way the others were not, prying it with the edge of a crowbar. Ben felt it give way. The brick came loose with a grating scrape of stone on stone. Behind it was a dark, square cavity, barely larger than the brick itself, its corners draped in thick, ancient cobwebs. For a moment, they just stared into the small black space, their initial excitement tempered by the sudden, eerie stillness. Their first thought was of a hidden floor, or a nest, but as Chloe angled her light deeper into the opening, it glinted off something metal. Carefully, Ben reached into the dark space. His fingers brushed against cold, rough metal. He pulled the object out into the light. It was a simple, grey metal lockbox, the kind used for petty cash or important papers. It was heavy, its surface pitted with rust, but it was sealed shut. They looked at each other, the dust motes dancing in the beam of light between them. The sounds of their renovation, the hammers, the scraping, were gone. The room was now filled with a profound and heavy silence, the silence of a secret. They carried the box to the kitchen table as if it were a sacred artifact. There was no key. Ben retrieved a screwdriver from his toolbox and, with a final, protesting screech of metal, pried the lid open. There was no treasure inside, no gold, no jewels, no stacks of cash. Instead, there was paper, a thick bundle of envelopes, wrapped tightly in a piece of faded baker's twine. They were bone dry, perfectly preserved in their dark, forgotten chamber. With gentle, almost reverent hands, Chloe lifted the bundle out. She untied the twine, which crumbled at her touch. The letters were standard-issue government envelopes. She turned the top one over. The stamp was a 22-cent flag, an issue from 1985. The postmark was clear: Maple Creek, Vermont, October 23rd, 1985, and the handwriting on the front was an elegant, if slightly shaky, cursive. It was from Arthur Pendleton, and it was addressed to a Mr. Thomas Abernathy, investigative reporter, at the offices of the Burlington Gazette. None of them had ever been mailed. The kitchen, which moments before had been a chaotic construction zone, was now as quiet as a library. The only sound was the rustle of dry paper as Chloe carefully unfolded the first of Arthur Pendleton's letters. Ben stood behind her, his hands on the back of her chair, reading over her shoulder. The words, written in a steady and precise hand, began to unspool a story that had been silenced for nearly 4 decades. The first few pages were methodical, almost clinical. Arthur laid out his observations like a prosecutor building a case. He listed dates and times when he had seen Finch timber trucks on federally protected land. He noted the license plates, including the one he'd recorded in his pocket notebook on his final day. He described how the trucks would enter the woods with their beds empty and emerge hours later, riding low on their suspension, their cargo hidden under heavy tarps. He was not just a postman, he was a watchman, and his route gave him a unique vantage point on the town's secret traffic. As the letters continued, the tone began to shift. The detached observer gave way to a concerned citizen, a man wrestling with his conscience. He wrote of the Finch family's deep roots in Maple Creek, their perceived generosity, the way they sponsored the local Little League team and donated to the town library. He questioned himself, wondering if he was misinterpreting what he saw, but the evidence he collected was undeniable. He named names, most notably Marcus Finch, the patriarch's arrogant son. Arthur described Marcus as a man who moved with an air of impunity, driving his pickup truck with a reckless disregard for the town's quiet streets and its unwritten rules. Ben and Chloe felt as though they were trespassing in the final weeks of a man's life. They were following his journey from suspicion to investigation to a dawning, dreadful certainty. The final letter in the stack was different. The envelope was unsealed. The handwriting, usually so controlled, was hurried and spidery. It was dated October 24th, 1985. "He knows," the letter began. "Marcus confronted me today on Route 7. He didn't threaten me outright, but his eyes, he knows I've been watching. He asked what an old mailman was doing so far off his route. It wasn't a question. It was a warning." The letter detailed the brief, chilling encounter, then ended abruptly. "I fear they are capable of more than just stealing trees. I will seal this and mail the entire package from Burlington tomorrow. It's not safe to do so from here." A cold dread settled in the room. That tomorrow had never arrived for Arthur Pendleton. Chloe's hands trembled slightly as she stacked the letters back into a neat pile. Ben, who had been the pragmatist, the one focused on wood and nails, was silent, his face grim. The story was no longer just an interesting historical footnote. It felt alive and dangerous. With a sudden sense of urgency, Chloe turned to her laptop, its modern glow a stark contrast to the analog mystery on the table. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she typed the name on the envelopes. Thomas Abernathy, Burlington Gazette. The search results populated instantly. At the top of the list was a link to a digital newspaper archive. She clicked it. A yellowed newspaper page from November 1st, 1985, appeared on the screen. It was a short, unremarkable obituary. Thomas Abernathy, a respected, investigative reporter, had passed away suddenly from a massive coronary event. He was 46 years old. He had died exactly 1 week after Arthur Pendleton had vanished. Ben let out a slow breath, staring at the screen. A massive heart attack, just 1 week later. Chloe's face was resolute, but her voice was low and laced with dread. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Arthur was silenced, and the one man he was trying to warn was dead. The secret wasn't just buried in their fireplace. It was buried in the town cemetery. An argument, quiet and tense, followed. Ben's instinct was for self-preservation. This was a powerful family. The events were nearly 40 years old. "What are we supposed to do, Chloe? Kick this hornet's nest? We came here for a quiet life, not to solve a cold case murder." Chloe's face was resolute. As a historian, she believed that truth was not bound by time. "We can't be the ones to bury him again, Ben," she said, her voice low but firm. "We found this. If we put it back in the wall, we're a part of the silence. Arthur deserves better than that." Her conviction was absolute. Ben looked from the letters on the table to the determined look in his partner's eyes, and he knew she was right. They had a duty not just to the ghost of a long-dead postman, but to the truth itself. The next morning, they made a call. They didn't dial 911. They looked up the current leadership of the Maple Creek Sheriff's Department. They found a sheriff. Miller, a woman who had been transferred to the region only 3 years prior, an outsider with no ties to the town's old allegiances. The meeting took place in a small, sterile office that smelled of disinfectant and coffee. Sheriff Miller was a woman in her late 30s with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She listened patiently, her expression unreadable, as Ben and Chloe nervously recounted their story from the fireplace demolition to the reporter's obituary. When they finished, Chloe pushed the rusty metal box across the polished desk. Sheriff Miller looked down at the box, then at the earnest, worried faces of the couple in front of her. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she reached out, her fingers tracing the rusted lid of the box. She lifted it and with professional care picked up the top envelope, examining the faded stamp and the elegant, haunting handwriting of Arthur Pendleton. The Pandora's box of Maple Creek was now officially open. Sheriff Miller did not treat the rusted box as gospel. She treated it as a map. In the climate-controlled stillness of the county evidence room, she located the original case file for Arthur Pendleton. It was thin, its manila folder softened with age. Inside, the typewritten pages were yellowed, the language sparse and dismissive. It was the anatomy of a case that was never meant to be solved. She sat for an hour, absorbing the official narrative, the dead ends, the quick and tidy conclusion of a man who simply walked away. Then she opened a digital scan of Arthur's letters on her computer screen. Side by side, the two stories began to speak to each other across the decades. She found the first connection on page 3 of Arthur's meticulous account, the license plate of the Finch timber truck. She cross-referenced the number with the old case file. Buried in a supplementary report, she found it. A claim filed on November 5, 1985, by a 25-year-old Marcus Finch for a company truck that had been stolen. The vehicle, the report stated, was later found by police completely destroyed by fire in a remote stone quarry. In 1985, it was an insignificant detail, a minor act of vandalism in the periphery of a disappearance, but in the light of Arthur's letter it was a flare, illuminating a direct link between the missing man and the powerful family. It was the first thread. Miller knew if she pulled it, the whole tapestry of lies might unravel. Her next stop was the desk of deputy clerk, a man whose tenure with the department was longer than Miller's own lifespan. He was a few months from retirement, a walking archive of the town's history. She asked him about the Pendleton case. Clark leaned back in his chair, his eyes looking at a point somewhere in the past. He remembered. He spoke of the old sheriff's weekly fishing trips with Alistair Finch, of the subtle but unmistakable pressure to look anywhere but at the town's largest employer. We were told to treat it as a tragedy, not a crime, Clark said, his voice low. The official story was written before the ink was even dry on the missing person report. With the deputy's informal testimony providing context and Arthur's letters providing a guide, Sheriff Miller's investigation gained momentum. She used modern GIS mapping software to overlay 1980s property records onto current satellite imagery. She confirmed that the forbidden logging trail Arthur had observed was the sole point of access to a 200-acre parcel of woodland that had been purchased a year earlier by a shell corporation, a corporation whose registered agent was Alistair Finch's personal attorney. Armed with the torched truck report, Clark's statement, and the undeniable property records, Sheriff Miller now had more than suspicion. She had probable cause. A judge agreed. The warrant she obtained was not for a home or an office, but for a quiet, forgotten piece of land deep in the Vermont woods. The search team arrived. On a grey, overcast morning, the scene was a stark juxtaposition of time. Young forensic technicians in clean blue jackets unloaded sensitive, ground-penetrating radar equipment onto soil that had been undisturbed for nearly 40 years. They began a systematic sweep of the area, their eyes fixed on their monitors, watching the silent pulses of energy probe the earth below. Hours passed. Then one of the technicians called out. He pointed to his screen, where a distinct, man-made anomaly interrupted the natural strata of the soil 6 feet down. The excavation was slow and methodical. They dug with shovels and then with trowels, scraping away layers of dirt like archaeologists. Near the bottom of the pit, a trowel struck something hard. Not a rock, but metal. The technician carefully brushed away the soil, revealing a tarnished brass buckle, its details obscured by decades of corrosion. But even through the grime, the faint outline of an eagle was visible. It was the buckle. From a United States Postal Service uniform. They had found him. The confrontation was quiet and clinical. Sheriff Miller didn't send a squad car to the Finch Timber headquarters. She called Marcus Finch, now a silver-haired 63-year-old pillar of the community, and requested he come to the station to clarify a few details on an old corporate land deed. Marcus arrived looking untroubled, projecting an air of bored cooperation. He sat across from Miller in the stark, windowless interrogation room, a man in a tailored suit who was clearly unused to being summoned. Miller began calmly, asking about his company's history, about his father's legacy. Marcus answered with smooth, practiced responses. Then she slid a folder across the table. Inside was a copy of the 1985 stolen vehicle report he had filed. His composure flickered for the first time. She followed it with a plat map of the remote property, showing its link to his family. The confident smile was gone. Finally, she placed a clear, high-resolution photograph on the table. It was the brass postal buckle, cleaned of dirt, its eagle emblem now sharp and unmistakable. The silence in the room was absolute. The mask of Marcus Finch did not just crack, it disintegrated. The respectable CEO was gone, replaced by the terrified young man from 1985. The story, when it came, was not a defiant shout, but a weary, defeated whisper. It hadn't been a plan, he claimed. He and another foreman, long since dead, had only meant to scare the nosy postman. But Arthur wouldn't be scared. He stood his ground, clutched his mailbag, and said he had a duty. There was a struggle, a shove. Arthur fell backwards, his head striking a rock with a sickening crack. It was a moment of stupid, panicked violence. But the cover-up directed by his father Alistair over the phone that night was ruthlessly efficient. They moved the body under the cover of darkness. They torched the truck, and for 38 years, the truth lay buried under 6 feet of Vermont soil. The arrest of Marcus Finch did not heal the town of Maple Creek. It fractured it. The news spread not like a cleansing fire, but like a shockwave, cracking the very foundations of the community's identity. The Finch name, once synonymous with prosperity and civic duty, was now inextricably linked to a dark, 38-year-old secret. Neighbors who had shared pleasantries for decades now avoided eye contact at the local market. The sign at the entrance of the Finch timber mill was vandalized overnight, its proud lettering dripping with spray paint. The story of the quiet postman, once a sad local myth, had been resurrected as a grim and shameful reality. Justice, in its arrival, felt less like a victory and more like an autopsy, laying bare the town's long-held sickness for all to see. For the crime of 1985, a panicked act of violence, Marcus Finch might have faced a lesser charge. But for the conspiracy of silence that followed, for the decades of lies, the calculated cover-up, and the theft of a good man's name, there was no statute of limitations. The justice system would hold him accountable, not just for ending a life, but for erasing a history. Weeks later, a small, quiet funeral was held for Arthur Pendleton. His daughter Sarah had returned to Maple Creek. The frantic, desperate young woman of 1985 was gone, replaced by a grandmother in her late 60s with her father's observant eyes and a profound, weary grace. She stood under a grey, Vermont sky as her father's casket was finally lowered into the earth, not in a forgotten patch of woodland, but in the town cemetery, next to the wife he had lost so many years before. There were no grand eulogies, only the quiet dignity of a homecoming, 38 years late. Before she left town, Sarah paid a visit to the old house. Ben and Chloe welcomed her into a home transformed. The air was warm, the floors were polished, and in the living room, a modern black wood stove stood where the monolithic brick fireplace had once been. The fire inside burned brightly, casting a steady, comforting glow. Sarah ran her hand along the new wall, the place where the secret had been kept. She turned to the young couple, her expression one of immense, complicated gratitude that words could not fully capture. "He was a good man," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "He believed in doing the right thing, no matter how small. You did the right thing." She handed Chloe a small framed photograph she had brought with her. It was of a much younger Arthur, smiling proudly in his postal uniform, standing beside his van. "So you can remember the man," she said, "and not just the mystery." That evening, Ben and Chloe sat before their fire. The house was finally theirs, peaceful and warm. They had come here seeking a quiet life and had, by accident, unearthed a story of violence and deceit. But in doing so, they had done more than just solve a crime. They had returned a man's name to his daughter, and given a measure of peace to a house that had held its breath for far too long. They were now part of its history, the keepers of the final chapter of Arthur Pendleton's story. The story of Arthur Pendleton reminds us that the truth is never truly lost. It can be buried under layers of dirt, sealed behind brick and mortar, and silenced by years of fear. But it remains. It is patient. And sometimes all it takes is a mundane act, the simple decision to fix a broken fireplace, to provide the spark that brings it all back into the light. Our mission here is to give voice to those who have been silenced. We believe that every cold case holds a story waiting to be told, honoring the legacy of the victims and the perseverance of those who, whether by chance or by choice, finally uncover the truth. If you believe these journeys of discovery deserve to be heard, join our community of storytellers by subscribing to the channel. Leave a like to ensure Arthur's story reaches more people and share in the comments. What detail of this investigation shocked you the most? The 38-year-old secret in the fireplace, or the conspiracy of silence that kept it hidden for so long?